The morning Margaret Davidson discovered her fiancé had fallen for a pop star was the same morning she realized she had been living someone else's dream for 37 years. It started with a phone call that shattered the crystalline silence of her Hamptons estate at precisely 6:47 a.m. Margaret had been sipping her Earl Grey, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic in shades of gold, when her wedding planner's voice crackled through the speaker with news that would change everything. "Margaret, darling, we have a situation. Richard isn't coming to the wedding. He's with Selena Gomez." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Margaret set down her teacup with the practiced composure that had been drilled into her since childhood. But inside, something was shifting like tectonic plates preparing for an earthquake. Selena Gomez. The name echoed in her mind, conjuring images of red carpets, screaming fans, and a life so far removed from her own carefully curated existence that it might as well have been happening on another planet. The china cup slipped from Margaret's fingers, crashing against the marble floor in a symphony of destruction that seemed to echo the shattering of her carefully constructed life. But in that moment of devastation, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing weight of despair she anticipated, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, a strange, almost intoxicating sense of freedom. She stared at the broken porcelain scattered across the floor, each shard catching the morning light like tiny mirrors reflecting different versions of herself. How fitting, she thought, that her perfect morning routine should end in chaos on the day she was supposed to become Mrs. Richard Ashworth III. The irony wasn't lost on her that her world was crumbling at the same moment she was supposed to be preparing for the happiest day of her life. How many of us spend our lives following a script written by others, never pausing to ask if it's the story we truly want to tell? Richard Ashworth III had been the perfect catch on paper. Heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, handsome in that clean-cut Kennedy way that photographed well at charity galas, and devoted enough to propose with a 12-carat diamond that had once belonged to a duchess. Their engagement had been the social event of the season, their upcoming wedding the talk of Manhattan's elite circles. Margaret had been the envy of every woman in her social sphere, and she had played the part of the grateful bride-to-be with Oscar-worthy dedication. The proposal itself had been orchestrated with military precision at the Metropolitan Opera during intermission of La Traviata, with half of New York society watching from their boxes. Richard had gotten down on one knee right there in the grand tier, and Margaret had said yes because it was the moment she had been preparing for her entire adult life. The ring was exquisite, the setting was perfect, and the photographs made the society pages of every major publication. It should have been the culmination of everything she had ever wanted. But even then, even in that spotlight moment with everyone watching and applauding, Margaret had felt like she was observing the scene from outside herself, watching a woman who looked like her accepting a proposal that felt like someone else's dream. She had attributed the strange disconnection to nerves, to the overwhelming nature of such a public proposal, to anything except the truth that was becoming clearer with each passing day. But as she stood there in her silk robe, surrounded by the debris of her morning routine, Margaret began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle, then grew into something wild and liberating that surprised even her. The absurdity of it all, her billionaire fiancé running off with a pop star 20 years younger than them both, struck her as the most honest thing that had happened in their entire relationship. You see, Margaret had always known something was missing. During their 2 years together, she had felt like an actress playing a role, delivering lines about shared dreams and future plans that never quite felt authentic. Richard would talk about their life together, the houses they would buy, the charities they would support, the children they might have, and Margaret would nod and smile, wondering why his vision of their future felt like watching someone else's movie. Their conversations had always felt rehearsed, like two people reading from scripts they had memorized but never truly understood. When Richard spoke about expanding his family's pharmaceutical empire, Margaret would murmur appropriate responses about supporting his ambitions. When he discussed their future children attending the right schools and joining the right clubs, she would agree while secretly wondering if she even wanted children, or if that was just another expectation she had never questioned. The most telling moment had come 3 weeks earlier, during a dinner party at the Ashworth family estate in Connecticut. Margaret had excused herself to the powder room and overheard Richard's mother talking to another guest about the wedding. "She's perfect for Richard," Mrs. Ashworth had said in her crisp Boston accent. "Beautiful, well-bred, and she'll photograph wonderfully at all the corporate events. She knows exactly how to be what he needs." Standing there in the hallway, Margaret had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. She'll photograph wonderfully. She knows how to be what he needs. Not who she was, but what she could be shaped into. Not love, but compatibility. Not passion, but propriety. The irony wasn't lost on her that it took a celebrity to reveal the celebrity-like performance her own life had become. Here she was, Margaret Davidson, successful interior designer, accomplished equestrian, daughter of old money and newer achievements, and she had been living as if she were auditioning for the role of perfect wife, rather than being herself. Her phone buzzed with another call, her mother, no doubt having heard the news through the rapid-fire gossip network that connected Manhattan's upper echelons faster than any news outlet. Margaret let it ring. Then another call from her best friend Caroline, probably calling to offer sympathy and scandal in equal measure. She let that ring too. Instead, Margaret walked to her window and really looked at the ocean for the first time in months. When was the last time she had taken a moment to simply exist without performing? When had she last made a decision based purely on what she wanted, rather than what was expected? The wedding had been scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. 300 guests, a reception that cost more than most people's homes, flowers flown in from 3 different continents. The thought of calling it all off should have been devastating. Instead, Margaret found herself calculating how much money she could donate to charity with what they would save, how many people she could actually help instead of simply impressing. The guest list read like a who's who of American high society and international business. Cabinet members, Fortune 500 CEOs, European nobility, Hollywood A-listers who moved in their philanthropic circles. The wedding was meant to be more than a celebration of love. It was a merger, a networking event, a photo opportunity for the society pages. Margaret realized now that she had been as much a part of the decor as the orchids and the ice sculptures. Her wedding dress hung in the closet upstairs, a masterpiece of French couture that had required 6 fittings and cost more than most people's cars. Looking at it now, Margaret couldn't remember feeling excited about wearing it. She remembered feeling relieved that it fit properly, that the photographs would be flattering, that she would look the part. But when had she stopped caring about how she felt and started obsessing about how she looked? She poured herself another cup of tea and called her wedding planner back. "Patricia, cancel everything. Send the flowers to local hospitals, donate the food to shelters, and tell the guests that sometimes the best weddings are the ones that never happen." Patricia's voice reached a pitch that could have shattered crystal. "Margaret, dear, surely you don't mean—" "I've never meant anything more clearly in my life," Margaret said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "And Patricia, thank you. Today you've helped me remember who I am." The next few hours brought a parade of phone calls that Margaret handled with increasing confidence. Her mother, predictably, was mortified. "What will people say, Margaret? The Ashworth family, our reputation." "Mother," Margaret interrupted gently, "what will people say about a woman who had the courage to recognize that she was about to marry the wrong person for all the wrong reasons?" Her father's call was different. After 43 years of marriage to her mother, Robert Davidson had learned to read between the lines. "Maggie," he said, using the childhood nickname that no one else was allowed to speak, "how are you really doing?" "I'm discovering that getting left at the altar might be the best thing that's ever happened to me," she answered honestly. There was a pause, then her father's warm chuckle. "I always wondered if you were happy, sweetheart. Richard is a good man, but he never seemed to see the fire in you that I've always loved." "What fire, Dad? I think I've been so busy being what everyone expected that I forgot I ever had one." "Oh, Maggie, you've always had it. Do you remember when you were 16 and you found that injured hawk in our garden? Your mother wanted to call animal control, but you insisted on nursing it back to health yourself. You researched everything about hawks, built it a proper habitat, fed it by hand for weeks. When it finally flew away, you cried for hours, but you said it was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen. That's fire, sweetheart. That's passion. That's who you are when you're not trying to be who you think you should be." Margaret felt tears she hadn't realized she was holding back begin to flow. When was the last time someone had reminded her of who she used to be before she became who she was supposed to be? That afternoon, instead of walking down an aisle toward a future that belonged to someone else, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She drove to the animal shelter where she had volunteered during college, before her life became consumed with the business of being successful and marriageable. The drive took her through parts of Long Island she hadn't seen in years, past strip malls and working-class neighborhoods that existed in a completely different universe from the Hamptons. She found herself noticing things she had trained herself to overlook: children playing in front yards, elderly couples sitting on porches, small businesses with hand-painted signs. When had she started seeing the world through such a narrow lens, focusing only on the gilt-edged corners of society? The shelter was still there, though expanded and modernized. The young woman at the front desk looked up as Margaret entered, still wearing the designer dress she had chosen for her wedding day brunch, a soft lavender silk that had cost more than most people spent on their entire wedding outfit. "I'd like to volunteer," Margaret said simply. "Wonderful. Do you have experience with animals?" Margaret smiled, thinking of the German shepherd she had loved as a teenager, the horse she had trained and shown, the smaller creature she had rescued and nursed back to health before life taught her to be more practical. "I used to. I'd like to remember how." The intake coordinator, an energetic woman named Sarah who couldn't have been older than 25, handed Margaret a clipboard with forms to fill out. As Margaret wrote down her information, address, education, emergency contact, she realized how strange her life looked on paper. Ivy League education, impressive address, no current employment because she had never needed to work. On paper, she looked like exactly what she was, a woman whose primary occupation was being suitable. "What drew you to animal rescue?" Sarah asked as she reviewed Margaret's application. Margaret paused, pen hovering over the form. The honest answer was complicated. "I think I'm trying to remember who I used to be before I became who I thought I should be," she said finally. Sarah smiled, and Margaret was struck by how genuine it seemed compared to the practiced smiles she was used to receiving and giving. "That's the best reason I've ever heard," Sarah said. "Animals have a way of bringing out who we really are. They don't care about anything except whether you're being authentic with them." That evening, Margaret sat in her garden with a cup of chamomile tea and a golden retriever named Murphy, who had been returned to the shelter 3 times for being too energetic. He was sleeping peacefully beside her chair, his head resting on her feet, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt completely present in her own life. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Richard. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I know this seems crazy, but when I met her at the charity auction last month, something just clicked. I've never felt anything like it. I couldn't go through with a marriage knowing I wasn't giving you my whole heart. You deserve better than that." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thank you for being honest. And Richard, I hope you're happier being yourself than you ever were trying to be perfect." His response came quickly. "Are you really okay?" "I'm more than okay," she wrote. "I'm awake." And she was. As the days passed, Margaret began making choices that surprised everyone, most of all herself. She adopted Murphy, despite her mother's protests about dog hair on the antique furniture. She enrolled in veterinary school, something she had dreamed of doing before she was steered toward more practical pursuits. She sold the Hampton house and bought a smaller place with enough land for a rescue operation. As the days passed, Margaret began making choices that surprised everyone, most of all herself. She adopted Murphy, despite her mother's protests about dog hair on the antique furniture. She enrolled in veterinary school, something she had dreamed of doing before she was steered toward more practical pursuits. She sold the Hampton house and bought a smaller place with enough land for a rescue operation. The decision to go back to school at 37 raised eyebrows throughout her social circle. "Darling, surely you're not serious about becoming a veterinarian," her mother had said during one of their increasingly tense phone calls. "What will people think? You have a degree from Vassar in art history. You speak 4 languages. You were bred for better things than cleaning up after animals. But Margaret had never felt more alive than she did studying anatomy and pharmacology, learning about animal behavior and nutrition. Her classmates were mostly in their 20s, focused and passionate in a way that reminded her of who she used to be. She was older than all of them, sometimes older than their professors, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was physical and emotional too. Without the pressure of maintaining a perfect appearance for social events, Margaret found herself changing in ways both subtle and profound. Her hair grew longer and less carefully styled. Her wardrobe shifted from designer suits to practical clothes that could withstand whatever the day might bring. She learned to read the subtle signs of animal distress, to calm a frightened dog with nothing but patience and gentleness. Most importantly, she began saying yes to invitations that interested her and no to obligations that didn't. She joined a hiking group, took Spanish lessons, started painting again. She discovered that life without the pressure of being perfect was infinitely more interesting than life spent trying to appear flawless. 6 months later, at Murphy's adoption event for other difficult dogs, Margaret met David Chun, a veterinarian who had left his corporate job to run a mobile clinic for underserved communities. He was nothing like the men she was supposed to find attractive. He drove a practical Honda instead of a luxury car, wore khakis instead of designer suits, and talked about animals with the same passion most people reserved for discussing money. Their first conversation took place over a particularly anxious border collie mix who had been surrendered for being too smart for his own good. David was trying to assess the dog's behavioral needs while Margaret held him steady, and she found herself completely absorbed in the work rather than thinking about how she looked or what impression she was making. "He's not aggressive," David observed, watching the dog's body language. "He's just understimulated. Probably smarter than half the people who've tried to own him." "Like Murphy was," Margaret said, gesturing toward her own dog, who was demonstrating perfect recall despite the chaos of the adoption event. Everyone thought he was a problem, but he just needed someone who understood that intelligence isn't a flaw to be managed. David looked up from the clipboard he was writing on, really looking at her for the first time. "That's a pretty profound observation about dogs. And people." When he asked her to help him with a particularly anxious rescue dog, Margaret found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in months as they both ended up covered in mud and dog treats. David looked at her, dirt streaked across her cheek, her hair escaping from its careful arrangement, and said, "You know, you're even more beautiful when you're not trying to be perfect." "How do you know I was trying to be perfect?" Margaret asked. "Because," David said, gently brushing the dirt from her face, "I spent the first 10 years of my career trying to be perfect too. Corporate veterinary medicine, all about profit margins and efficiency. It's exhausting, isn't it? Always performing instead of just being." As Margaret looked into his eyes, she realized that this was what had been missing with Richard, the recognition, the understanding, the sense of being truly seen. With Richard, she had felt like a beautiful object to be admired. With David, she felt like a person to be known. The story of Richard and Selena's romance played out in the tabloids for months, a fairy tale of instant attraction and whirlwind courtship that captivated the public. Margaret found herself genuinely happy for them, understanding now that sometimes the most loving thing two people can do is recognize when they're not right for each other. A year later, Margaret received a wedding invitation that made her smile. Richard and Selena were getting married in a small ceremony in California, and they had included a handwritten note. "Thank you for understanding, and for showing us what grace looks like. We hope you've found your own happiness." The invitation was simple, elegant, and completely different from the elaborate affair that had been planned for her and Richard. Looking at it, Margaret felt nothing but genuine happiness for them. She had seen photos of them together in magazines. Richard looked relaxed and spontaneous in a way she had never seen him, and Selena glowed with a confidence that seemed to come from being truly loved for who she was rather than what she represented. Margaret RSVP'd that she couldn't attend. She would be in Guatemala with David, providing veterinary care to animals in remote villages. But she sent them a gift along with a note of her own. "Sometimes the best thing that can happen to your life is having it completely disrupted. Wishing you both the courage to keep being yourselves." The Guatemala trip had been David's idea, part of a rotating program that brought veterinary care to communities that had no other access. Margaret had thrown herself into the preparation, studying tropical diseases and parasites, learning basic Spanish phrases for communicating with pet owners, researching the cultural context of animal care in rural Central America. She felt more excited about this trip than she had about any of the luxury vacations she had taken with Richard to places where they had done nothing but pose for photos and make small talk with other wealthy tourists. That evening, as Margaret sat with David on the porch of their modest home, Murphy and 3 other rescue dogs sprawled around them, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. If someone had told her 2 years ago that getting left at the altar would lead to the happiest chapter of her life, she would have thought they were crazy. But isn't that how the best stories unfold, not according to our careful plans, but according to the unexpected twists that force us to discover who we really are? Do you ever regret it? David asked, following her gaze toward the sunset. What? Getting left at the altar by a billionaire for a pop star? Margaret laughed. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. Even though everyone thought you were living the perfect life? Margaret turned to look at the man beside her, kind, genuine, more interested in healing than impressing, and then at the animals they had rescued together, the life they had built from authenticity rather than expectation. David, she said, I was living someone else's idea of a perfect life. Now I'm living my own imperfect, messy, absolutely wonderful life. There's no comparison. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret realized that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. Sometimes what feels like rejection is actually redirection. And sometimes the most devastating thing that can happen to the life you thought you wanted is exactly what you need to discover the life you actually want to live. The question isn't whether unexpected changes will come to disrupt our carefully laid plans. They will. The question is whether we'll have the courage to see these disruptions as invitations to become more authentically ourselves. So tell me, when life inevitably asks you to choose between the safe path and the true path, between what looks good and what feels right, between the person others expect you to be and the person you actually are, what will you choose? And when that moment comes, because it will come, will you have the courage to let your heart be stolen by your own authentic life?